Hey everybody, this is Jackie Luqman.
And this is Uncle Baba Luqman.
And we are here for a quick treat special in Luqman Nation, in the Cypher in Luqman Nation, talking about the United Nations.
Yes. First of all, we'd like to thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Hit the subscribe, the like, share this video.
Yes.
Invite your friends, even your enemies. And invite them to the most dangerous platform, the most dangerous show in social media.
So when we start talking about this thing with the UN, I think it's very important that we start with a particular point in history. So let me share this video with you so you can understand the perspective that we're coming from when we're talking about the United Nations.
At the League of Nations, a grave disturbance. Today, Haile Selassie comes to plead for his lost empire. He wants them to make Mussolini give up Ethiopia. The Geneva crowds are for him, but the exiled emperor will need his imperturbable dignity before the day is over. British Foreign Minister Eden, Soviet delegate Litvinov on the left, and French Premier Blum, and all the statesmen, instead of helping Haile Selassie, have decided to lift the sanctions against Italy. The introduction of the emperor in English.
I call upon the first delegate of Ethiopia. The speech which you are about to hear will be given in the Amharic language.
In the shadows of the press gallery, Italian newspaper men are ready for an outbreak against the emperor whose country their country has taken, waiting for his first words.
Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le...
Trying to quell the disturbance, lights turned out. Again, lights out. The disturbers ejected, arrested, and he is able to make his appeal.
የሚገባውን ትክክለኛ ፍርድ ለመጠየቅ ዛሬ በዚህ ቀርቤያለሁ። ምክንያቱም ወታደሮቹ ቦምቡ በወደቀ ጊዜ ጋዙን ነፋስ እስኪወስደው ድረስ መከታተሉን ስላወቁበት ነው።
An ovation, yes, but he gets no help. The League lifts the sanctions against Italy. Applause, and that's all.
Was the precursor or the forerunner of what we now call the United Nations. It was an attempt of nations to basically come together after World War I, or what they call the Great War.
Right.
And so it was supposed to be like the United Nations today, an attempt by nations to have a body where nations can come together and diplomatically solve their problems before it reaches to conflict or armed conflict. We see that the League of Nations was doomed to fail from the start. After the Great War, President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, who was a great proponent of the League of Nations, who felt like this was a great idea. It also had the backing of the American public, who did not want to experience another war like World War I. And they was like, well, if you countries could come together, and the way that it was presented to them, and avoid war by all costs, let's do that. Well, there was one major issue. The major issue, though, is that even though Woodrow Wilson was for it, he did not allow the United States to join.
Oh, really?
So the reason why the United States didn't join the League of Nations is because of a provision in the charter of the League of Nations, which stated that any attack on any member of the League of Nations, the United States and other countries were obliged to defend that country.
Oh, okay.
This went against the isolationist tone of the United States at the time.
Mhm.
So Congress basically did not. Congress went against Woodrow Wilson's. Went against the United States entering it. Now, this is kind of important if you think about the way that U.S. policy is being played out now. You had a Congress that at the time that did not want to see the United States involved internationally in that way. Having the United States being obliged to defend any country militarily. Now let's look at it. The United States at that time, even coming out of the Great War, was not a military power at all. The United States was a very third-rate military power. Even after coming out of the Great War, they came out of the Great War, or World War I, as they say, in a lot better position, where Germany was basically destroyed. The League of Nations being the body that facilitated the Versailles Treaty that the Germans wind up rebelling against, which led to the rise of Hitler. Actually, the German rebellion against the Versailles Treaty. So again, the United States didn't. The United States didn't allow. They didn't want to become part of the League of Nations because the United States was running roughshod. It wasn't all about isolationism. What it is about Wilsonian diplomacy too. Wilsonian diplomacy, which the United States was running roughshod in the Western Hemisphere, and it was also running roughshod in Europe after the Great. And they didn't want to really be restrained by an international body such as the League of Nations. So even though Wilson supported it, the United States was like they didn't want to be tethered by something that they by the same diplomacy that they were or the same methods that they were supporting. This scene the time when Haiti was invaded by the United States and the Marines and stuff, and that was supposed to be in the guise of preventing foreign forces of coming into Haiti and taking over and stuff like that. So the United States basically had its own agenda, and they didn't want to be tied down by this stuff.
So when Haile Selassie goes to speak at the League of Nations at that time, that was 1930,
which was the only African nation that was a part of the League of Nations. The rest of Africa was colonized by the Europeans.
Still, wow.
Yeah. So Ethiopia, which has never been colonized, was the only African nation that was a sovereign African nation. Let me put that. That was a member of the League of Nations.
So when Emperor Haile Selassie goes to the League of Nations to make this speech, why did he go there? What was going on?
Well, Haile Selassie, first of all, this was Italy had invaded Ethiopia. When Haile Selassie made that speech, Haile Selassie was in exile. So he wasn't, he was living in exile because Ethiopia was invaded by the fascists, right? And Haile Selassie was appealing to the League of Nations to basically, punish Italy for invading its country. Actually, he was trying to make the League of Nations live up to what it was supposed to be about, solving these conflicts in a diplomatic manner. Well, because of racism and the fact that Haile Selassie was disrespected, as you've seen in the video, he was disrespected not only by the journalists of Italy, but what they didn't mention in that video, that he was also disrespected by representatives of Great Britain and others who felt like, that Ethiopia, that they didn't come to the defense of Ethiopia. And so they voted to basically absolve Italy of its actions and to lift the sanctions. It was previous sanctions on Italy for its invasion of Ethiopia. And so the League of Nations, they lifted all the sanctions and basically just gave a pass and told, but thank God Ethiopian people wound up defeating Italy.
Wow.
So, that's down the line. But yeah, that's how that went. And so the League of Nations had several failures. One of the failures was not only its ineptitude or its weakness towards fascism. They were unable to stop Germany from taking over the Rhineland. They was unable to stop German aggression, especially since the rise of the Nazi Party and this German nationalism and militarism that was taking place under the Nazis, which used the Versailles Treaty as basically a bullying point, for the German people, which caused which basically fueled the nationalism of Germany, and it also caused Hitler and the Nazis to come into power, and the League of Nations was unable to stop Italian fascism. They were unable to do anything about fascism in Spain, and they were also unable to do anything about the Japanese expansion, militaristic expansion in Asia when the Japanese annexed Korea, and they went into Manchuria, and so the expansion there, and the League of Nations just was looked at as an impotent organization. The fact that the United States wasn't part of it, also the fact that Italy, Germany, and Japan all left. So you had three of maybe like the world's major military powers and economic powers, rising economic powers, all three fascists, or imperialists, in the term of Japan. They all left the League of Nations. So there was really, the League of Nations was like it existed to do what? It had, it couldn't enforce any of its charters. It couldn't enforce, so it was basically it just didn't have any authority, had no power. It couldn't stop these countries like Germany and them from taking over other countries. So it just, it was a failure in all that respect.
So then when we look at the origins of the League of Nations and the inability of the body to do anything about fascism, and in the case of Ethiopia, the member nations at the time basically voted to let Italy have Ethiopia in support of the fascists and what you just said. So when the League of Nations becomes the United Nations, how should we be looking at the efficacy of the United Nations in doing the same thing, in responding to like apartheid, fascism? And we're getting at something here because the United States just stopped the United Nations from issuing a statement, from simply issuing a statement in regard to Israel's latest attacks of Palestine in Gaza. 5 times the United States alone stopped the United Nations Security Council from issuing a statement condemning Israel's actions, not doing anything. The United States stopped them from even issuing a statement, and the UN Security Council went along with it.
Right.
The United States voted no, and the Security Council was like, okay, well, them's the rules. So when we're looking at the United Nations now, and we see the way they don't really respond to a country that is right now being under siege from another country, how do we put this in context of the way the League of Nations, the United Nations began with the way the League of Nations responded to Ethiopia?
Well, I think that the United Nations is a less democratic institution than the League of Nations. The League of Nations didn't have a Security Council. So here it is. You had more of a democratic process with the League of Nations, where that you don't have with the United Nations today. The fact that a Security Council remains that can veto anything didn't exist under the League of Nations. So it's a less democratic institution than the League of Nations was. And it caused again the points that you brought up. It's causes the problems that you just mentioned. We talk about the United States having the type of veto power that it does in reference to Israel, but also was doing that with South Africa during the apartheid regime.
Right.
So so we've seen the United States even block resolutions from the United Nations when it came to what racism is or what Zionism is,
Right.
or when the world body comes together and decides on an issue as an organization. If it doesn't suit the United States interests or the interests of Great Britain or other so-called powerful rich countries, they just overturn that. So, you know, so right then and there, they have shown time and time again how that the United Nations is basically just exists as a symbolic gesture. You know, that it really doesn't have any, even in the peacekeeping aspect, the armed wing, the peacekeepers, the armed wing of the United Nations, basically are told that they can't engage an enemy. So they're there, but they're, you know, we've seen in cases of places like Rwanda and other places, in Haiti and other places where they're there to keep the peace, how they would stand by and watch people get massacred. So, you know, and because they have this mandate that they can't get involved militarily to protect the people that they're supposed to be there for, you know.
Right.
So you know, so again, you're talking about an organization that has shown itself to be impotent in matters of protecting life and property of people, you know, and actually being the puppet, you know, of powerful nations, and especially like the security councils and stuff like that. So we've seen time and time again that there has been attempts by other nations to try to change that, you know, to these permanent, and think about that. And the Security Council, permanent members of the Security Council.
Right.
You know, I mean, you know, that alone shows you how undemocratic it is.
Right.
You know,
right.
So you still have the power dynamics that is that we see. The United Nations reflect the very power dynamics that we see now. Powerful countries in charge, and the lesser powerful countries or less powerful countries and poorer countries being dictated to, or, you know, being controlled by, or being not allowed. You know, and it's funny because, you know, we talk about African nations and why so many African nations joined the United Nations. And it was for that very same reason that the United Nations Charter, I think Article 73, had one in that article, it said that, you know, nations had a right to self-determination. Right. They had a right to control their own institutions and outside of foreign influences. And so during the 1960s, which they call the Year of Africa, when a lot of African nations was going for independence, this was like a natural progression for these newly independent African states to take the United Nations at its word and realize that it would be some form of it would be an organization that would have some form of protection and allow these newly formed independent states, you know, quote unquote, you know, to actually experience self-determination without being, and also have a voice in the affairs of the world, you know, something that Africa for a long time has not had. Right. So, you know, to be able to be heard on the world stage, not through the voices of their colonialist occupiers,
right, but to have a voice themselves
right. So the United Nations was very attractive, but we find out, you know, as we all know through the history, that, you know, because of the United States and mainly the United States, but others who occupied this permanent position on the Security Council, that a lot of the African voices were stifled.
So of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, how many of those permanent members are from African nations? I
think the last, and you know, I think it was Algeria or one of those nations that wind up having a seat on the security, but you have one seat. You have permanent members. You have the United States. You have Soviet Russia. I think you have China. I don't know if it's Britain or France. I'm not sure, but it's easy to find out. But you have those, but then you also have rotating seats on the Security Council, which are occupied by other nations, you know. But they don't have the vote that the United States and permanent members have.
That's what I'm getting to. Even if they have a seat that is either rotating or permanent, they do not have the equal voting
They don't, no.
Power that the United States and other European nations have, which again goes to your point of the undemocratic nature of the United Nations.
I never understood this. Also, when we talk about the attitude of the United States government when it came to the League of Nations, compared to now, where I always didn't understand why wasn't the United Nations, why was it on U.S. soil? Why was the United Nations in neutral Switzerland or somewhere, something like that? That also has the United States wield a lot of influence. The fact that the United Nations is building headquarters is on U.S. soil, and the fact that the United Nations, the United States contribute mostly to its budget.
Right.
So as much as Trump and others have railed against that, it has served the United States well, because what happens is, by the United States being the major funding country of the United Nations, it definitely gets its money worth.
Exactly. And you're right. The 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council are actually called the Big Five, and it is the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, France, and China. That's it. Everybody else gets to rotate,
right?
But they don't all get the same vote and influence that the United States does.
And the only non-white nation is China.
And how long you think that?
Right. Right.
And you see what the United States is doing with the way it is continually attacking China in this new court. Because this is another dynamic with this relationship with the United States, between the United States and China. China's a permanent member of the UN Security Council.
Right.
So the United States is doing everything it can to delegitimize China, to lob all of these human rights abuses against the country. That's why they're making such a big deal about this, because they want to delegitimize China, not just politically and on the world stage, but they want to delegitimize them at the United Nations.
Exactly. Yep.
Because, just because somebody is a permanent member of the UN, it doesn't mean that they can't be voted out.
Well, yeah, and the fact that it's not just China. We see the same play being with Russia, which is also a permanent member. So,
but but when we talk about the way the United States is trying to use these human rights abuses, allegations of human rights abuses against China, and I don't know what the process is to kick a member off of the Big Five, but I'm sure the United Nations has one if they violate, part of the charter. But the interesting thing is that the very same allegations of human rights abuses that the United States has been lobbying against China and Russia, and really just China and Russia, because they ain't saying nothing about the UK, because the UK is in, and certainly not France, because they are the allies of the United States. Those allegations are actually proven all the time, every day, just about, in this country against the United States.
Now, this is the amazing thing, just to go back for a minute, because you mentioned something about being allies. During the League of Nations, Ethiopia to this day is the U.S.'s oldest ally. So Ethiopia was an ally to the United States even during the time when Haile Selassie was in exile, and Ethiopia was under attack by the Italians. It's also important to point out that relationship wasn't honored by the United States when the United States forbid Black Americans from going to Ethiopia to fight on the side of Ethiopian soldiers against the Italians. The United States sided with the fascist Italians in order to prevent African Americans going over to Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is the United States' oldest ally, which even now has just put a lot of sanctions on Ethiopia because of the situation in Tigray, right? But Ethiopia, even more than Egypt or the other ones, even more than Israel, Ethiopia has been the United States' oldest ally.
Wow. And to back up your point, or to expand your point about the United States forbidding Black Americans from going to Ethiopia to fight for them against Italy, the United States didn't stop white people from going to Italy to fight for the fascists. So that is one part, a fascinating history of the evolution, the foundations and the evolutions of the United Nations, and who the United Nations has served and who it has not. But there's something that you mentioned a little bit ago that I want to go back to, and you talked about racism, and how the United States and Israel are always in disagreement about the definitions, how the United Nations defines racism and Zionism. To that point, there is evidence of this. We can show you this because in the United Nations, there was a 2001 conference in which, and this was published in the the New York Times, where the United States and Israel walked out of the United Nations meeting on racism in 2001.
I remember that.
I remember it too.
Yeah.
The delegates from the United States and Israel literally got up and walked out of the United Nations global meeting on racism and human rights abuses, denouncing a condemnation of Israel in a proposed conference declaration, and lamenting that a meeting intended to celebrate tolerance and diversity had, they said, degenerated into a gathering driven by hate. So what happened was they were defining and condemning racism and Zionism. Because Zionism is a white supremacist ideology. We talked about this on Black Power Media, and Theodore Herzl consulted Cecil Rhodes about how to colonize, how to make Zionism a successful colonial venture. So, and let's not act as if these people don't know this history. They know this history. They don't want the history to be exposed for what it is. So the United States delegates were angry that Zionism was equated with racism, and that Zionism was condemned, and the oppression of Palestinian people was condemned. So they walked out.
But it also shows you, again, the anti-democratic stance that the United Nations is, really, how undemocratic it is. Because if it was really a democratic institution, that is that so many of the members like the United States claim it is, then when the large body or majority members say that, hey, that we say that this is racism, well, democracy means that the majority rules. So it shows you how undemocratic the United Nations is and always was.
And just not to belabor this point, but I want people to make note of who made the statement about the United States' decision to walk out. It was Colin Powell. Colin Powell said, "I've taken this decision with regret because of the importance of the international fight against racism and the contribution that the conference could have made to it. But following discussions today by our team in Durban and others who are working for a successful conference, I'm not convinced that will not be, I am convinced that will not be possible." So Colin Powell was really not objecting to the language on racism. What he was objecting to was the language condemning Israel for its treatment of Palestinians.
That's all it was. It was basically the United States once again protecting Israel and Israel's apartheid, as opposed to but then that was the same attitude the United States had towards South African apartheid under the Reagan administration. Was this thing called constructive engagement. It wasn't what brought down apartheid in South Africa. The structural part of South Africa, apartheid in South Africa, was basically international pressure from the people, not governments like the United States or Great Britain, which was appeasing the South African government. And so we've seen that when apartheid did finally end, and we spoke about this on the show last week, we saw how the United States and Great Britain, in order to maintain that power dynamic, ran down there and took the nuclear weapons from South Africa that was supplied by Israel. And when we say supplied, the knowledge of building those nuclear weapons came from Israel. So the technology of the cruise missile. And I remember very well when South Africa first started building cruise missiles, and how when we used to have journalists at that time, how the journalists traced that knowledge back to the Israeli military that shared that knowledge with the South African government.
Right.
All of that stuff was basically buried and taken away once Black people got in control, because the power dynamics have to be maintained. One other point I want to make too, when we talk about the African nations joining the United Nations, like 17, I believe, or 17 African nations immediately joined the United Nations. Maybe 72 right now. I'm not sure, but it's really important to note that that the United Nations have more presence on the continent of Africa than they do anywhere else in the world.
Wow.
So let's look at that. Why and so that also shows how the United Nations, as opposed to being the so-called humanitarian project of the 20th century, or the latter part of the 20th century, to this vision of this more civilized world, that the United Nations also serves as a conduit for nation state, private, and corporate interests.
Right.
So you have a lot of the United States that you have a lot of United Nations organizations and stuff, including peacekeepers and military apparatuses that's represented more on the African continent than anywhere else in the world. And they're not just there as peacekeepers or and as we know, you're going to be sharing some stories about the corruption through some of these organizations, but they also, again, as I stated, they're conduits for corporate, private, and national interests of mainly the West.
Right. And just a correction, 54 African nations, all 54. There are only 54 countries in Africa.
Right.
I get this wrong all the time too. I don't know why I think there are more countries in Africa than there are. I don't know why. I like us multiplied, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, 54 African nations. All African nations are members of the United Nations. I dropped a link to that New York Times article in the chat for you, so you can reference it. There is a quote in the article in which Powell said that he was angry. The U.S. delegation and the Israeli delegation didn't like that they couldn't persuade the Arab delegates to remove criticism of Israel from the proposed conference document that talked about the racist practices of Zionism and described Israel's treatment of Palestinians as a new kind of apartheid. This was in 2001. That people were having this discussion about what was going on in Palestine, and that Israel was an apartheid state then. So that is extremely important. So
and what's interesting about that time period, 2001, this was also the beginning of the U.S. policy of unilateralism.
Oh yeah.
So so this was after 9/11. This is when the United States started with this policy of unilateralism, which means that they didn't really care about the United Nations. I mean, this was even publicly said by members of the Bush administration, where they said, "They look either with us or against us."
Yep.
So they basically themselves threw aside the mission and what the United Nations represented by going on this unilateral mission to invading Iraq and all that stuff. And the last person that was the last president to obey a UN mandate was George Bush Sr., who, when the first Gulf War, when the U.S. generals wanted to go into Baghdad, and George Bush Sr. said, no, the UN mandate is that we just liberate Kuwait.
Right.
And so he forbade General Schwarzkopf and Colin Powell at the time, who was also part of that war, to go into Baghdad to get Saddam Hussein. He said, we don't have the mandate from the UN for that. That was the last time that the United States, cooperated, at least publicly, with the United Nations mandate that respected the UN mandate. Since after that, when 2001 you mentioned, then the United States been even today on this unilateralism where the United Nations really don't mean anything.
Right. So since we're talking about Africa and the United Nations having such a presence in Africa, what's the relationship like? Well, let's take a look at what the relationship is like. It is not a good relationship. It's not a beneficial one. According to this article, and this is an article from September 21st of last year.
What is that?
I don't think he means, but oh boy, that would be bad if he. But it does look a little suspect.
Yeah.
But this is an article from in the Africa report that says the UN at 75 years. The United Nations was 75 years. 75 years old last year. Africa and the strained relationship. So that's such a good catch. So African nations, like you said, in 1960, when African nations began gaining independence, they joined the UN. They became member states. But what's it been like? UN peacekeeping in Africa has been a miserable failure. Now, why does the UN need to do anything about peacekeeping in Africa? Because of the thing we talk about all the time: U.S. and Western imperialism and the neo-colonial actions of the former colonizers of those same African nations, who are also members of the UN.
Exactly.
Which is such a messed up situation. So this article states that since the start, UN peacekeeping in Africa has been a miserable failure, tied to the whims of a Security Council, which is less and less capable of performing its basic functions. Africa has not been served well by UN interventions. Think about this. The colonial powers lost their colonies, but they found new ways to continue their influence in their former colonies. And the newly independent African states were like, no, we don't want this. We're going to fight you,
right? Because
we're independent. And these former colonizers, who are members of the United Nations, are on one side. The newly independent African nations are on the other side. And the UN peacekeeping forces are supposed to be stopping one member nation from invading and committing imperialism and neocolonialism.
They're supposed to be the military buffer.
They're supposed to be the military buffer. And remember, the rules are if you attack one member of the UN, then everybody has to defend.
Well, I'm not sure if that's a part. I know it was part of the League of Nations.
Okay, is that a UN?
I'm not sure it's part of the United Nations.
Because they don't roll like that.
Right? No, I mean, I think that's but it's funny you mention that, because now you have what really came out of that when the League of Nations said, every member state is militarily responsible, which is why the United States was like, well, we ain't getting that, but. The United Nations, I think, which doesn't have that, that led to these regional military alliances like NATO and all this stuff. So where they took it outside of the UN, the African Union and all these places, which felt like, okay, we can't rely militarily on the United. And it's funny about the African Union, which is different than NATO. And even different than the old Warsaw Pact alliances. What's different about the African Union alliances, folks, is that the African Union military alliances is heavily funded by the United Nations and United Nations member states. So the United Nations member states control the budget, the military budget of the African Union, which is the reason why the African Union has been so ineffective in a lot of the internal squabbles of African politics. For example, we were just now talking about Chad, right? And the fact that the African Union basically turned its back on Chad, turned its back, not even really getting involved in the Ethiopian Tigray situation, not getting involved in what's happening in Mali. It's France that's involved in all that stuff.
Right.
United States over in Ethiopia, but in Chad and in Mali, you see all of this, and now in Rwanda, where Macron went down there.
Right.
So you're seeing still this French. This French
might have had a little something to do with what happened in Rwanda.
Right. So you see a lot of this French involvement still. Again, goes back to your point about new ways of holding on to the colonial interest. But the African Union is not independent militarily. They are still controlled economically and their policy. They have to get permission from certain actors in the United Nations and stuff in order to even intervene in some of these countries.
That's insane. So that's so you have a so-called global governing body that's supposed to be keeping peace, right? But they know full well that the former colonists are still implementing neo-colonial policies and practices in the former colonies, and then they're gonna act like they're gonna send some peacekeeping forces to mediate things. Well, how does that work out? Well, they point out all of the most of the places in Africa, in African nations, where UN peacekeeping forces went in and made things worse, like in the Congo, in Rwanda, in South Sudan. And this is a really great article. It goes into a lot of good detail. They even point out that the United Nations goal, or their program of eradicating poverty on the continent of Africa, it isn't even close to being met. It's just insane.
But why? But and we're going to put that link in the chat.
Yep.
But also, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Why hasn't the goal of poverty eradication been met by the United Nations? Because of so many of the special interests, so many of the corporate interests that that the United Nations is a conduit for. The United Nations have really done nothing with stopping the exploitation of and the extraction of African resources by private interests and private companies and stuff.
Yep.
So I mean, and so yes, of course, you're going to have they're going to fall short of their goal.
Yeah. So another problem with the United Nations and the security forces and the peacekeeping forces, United Nations has the peacekeeping forces have a real serious sexual abuse problem. The Luqmans did not make this up.
Nope.
The people over at Human Rights Watch, which we understand is a very questionable outlet, but I think this is the fact that Human Rights Watch tends to have a right-wing bent sometimes. I think even highlights how bad this problem is, that even they pointed it out. So this article is, like I said, from Human Rights Watch from January of last year, and they talk about how UN peacekeeping has a sexual abuse problem. And what did they start off? What is the case they highlight? Haiti. The sexual abuses of the United Nations in Haiti. Just absolutely horrific. But that's not the only place where the United Nations had this problem. We heard about this issue with the United Nations in the Congo. We heard about this issue with the United Nations in other African nations. So we're going to drop this link here.
I mean, one thing we talked about at one of our shows, but one major issue was the sex for food.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That just repulsive behavior. These are supposed to be people who represent the global body that is supposed to keep peace.
Yes.
So Haiti is one of many countries where peacekeepers have raped women and girls or sexually exploited them, like you said, in exchange for food or support. We've also had reports of this from Somalia. French and UN peacekeepers in the Central African Republic, and UN troops in the Congo. Just we'll drop this link in there for you too. So you see, I hope you see where we're going. I hope you see what we're getting at here when the United States frequently cites, their cooperation with the United Nations and the United Nations this, and they're always talking about the United Nations as a force of good in the world. No, it's not. It really is not. Not when it comes to our people.
Right.
Not from Haile Selassie to what is going on in Haiti today, what is going on in, like you said, Mali, Somalia, the Tigray region. It's just the United Nations is worthless. They are in. Here's the question: are they unable to stop conflicts, or are they unwilling?
Well, I mean, the United Nations. I think that a lot of it. I think the inability to stop it has to do with, again, the powerful nations. Like you just named it. Let's take something as simple as condemning Israel. Now, the same United Nations, right? Just the other day came out, I mean, plain as day, and said that what's happening in Ethiopia is a war crime. This is the language they use. When it came to what was happening in Gaza, they said that the Israeli actions in Gaza may contribute to a war crime.
Possibly.
Right. We have to investigate if it is even considered a war crime. But they were clear when it came to the Ethiopian army with the Tigray situation, stuff like that. So that's one example. And we spoke about examples of how they can't even enforce a UN mandate or resolution. How many resolutions that Israel has been in violation of, yet the UN can't enforce it.
Right.
But they're very good at enforcing the through Interpol and stuff, of capturing African leaders and stuff.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
People who, and taking them to the Hague and all this other,
right. Right.
But yeah, I think a lot of it is the inability to do those things because of countries like the United States and others that wield so much power when it comes to the way that United Nations operate. Even in our situation, let's take it closer home. When it comes to UN, when the UN body has stated that the United States is a racist country, or police brutality in the United States results in human rights abuse and stuff, they all sound good, but in the end they're just words, because I mean, in the end, what happens? There's no censoring of the United States. There's no censoring of the way that the United States does things, And so when I look back on the League of Nations, and I think about, and so this also goes back to our Pan-Africanist slant, and our Pan-Africanist, which should be a Pan-Africanist goal. During the League of Nations, Germany, Italy, and Japan, United States member didn't sign on to the League of Nations.
Right.
But Japan, Italy, and Germany, they all left. And they left because they seen that the League of Nations was not in their best interest. The Nazis wanted get back for the Treaty of Versailles.
True.
Japan wanted to be a world power, and they wanted to control their sphere of influence, which was in Asia, the Pacific sphere of influence. Italy, which at that time boasted like the largest navy. I mean, on paper, Italy had a pretty mighty army until they started fighting. But again, these were sort of powerful militaries in their own right. So, but they all left, so I would love to see the day when the political situations in these African countries get to the point where you would have a major walkout of African nations from the United Nations. I would love to see that day come, and I think that they can only be facilitated through the implementation of Pan-Africanist political thought, Pan-Africanist ideology. because that's the only way that the United Nations already doesn't serve Africa. So the fact that these African nations are even still in the body of the United Nations really is a slap in the face. It's a mockery to everything that this organization is supposed to be about. It's a mockery to the people who still holding up this sham organization. And I would love to see the day when these African nations have the political guts, and the political guts meaning that someone there who is sincere, African governments who are sincere, in the vein of Thomas Sankara and in the vein of Patrice Lumumba and others, to say, hey, look, this is a sham. We're leaving this. We're going to follow the examples of the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians and the League of Nations. Why are we paying dues? Why are we paying dues to an organization that has not served us? And I always said, and that a lot of these leaders, they just want a chance to get to New York.
I mean, good grief. There are probably easier ways to get to New York City.
They just want to go to New York.
Who the heck wants to go to New York now? But anyway, I mean, as we wrap this up, what you just said is that was the vision of those people, of the Thomas Sankaras, of the Patrice Lumumbas, of the Kwame Nkrumahs, of the Muammar Gaddafis.
Yep.
This is why we know these ideas are effective, because they were so dangerous that the very institutions and bodies that we are calling to bringing to your attention have not served us. They're the ones who had those people wiped out. That's how you know an idea is not only dangerous, but it's effective. So this is why we have to keep fighting for what Thomas Sankara, what Patrice Lumumba, what Kwame Nkrumah and Kwame Ture and Muammar Gaddafi was fighting for: a united Africa,
exactly,
outside of and away from the influence and the power of the United States and the European nations. No, it's not going to happen next week. It's not going to happen next week. But if we keep fighting for it, it will happen one day. Our children, maybe our grandchildren, will see it realized one day. And if that's not enough of a reason for us to keep fighting for a united Africa and a united African diaspora, then you're hopeless.
Exactly. So again, as we end this, I just want to thank everybody. Yeah, we did sneak this in.
We did.
I want to shout out Easy D and Red Socialist, and of course Ricky Ryan and Lisa Catlett, who caught us. Let me see who else we have here. Emily M, Leslie, and there was another one too. Zari, Ali Cologne. There was another one, Mary Francis, of course, and Ziri, Z Marzi. I hope I'm saying that right.
Excuse me.
So all of you, if we thank you for joining. Oh, Leah Bowers, of course, Leah. Thank you for Forrest Hinton, Nancy Venter. Thank y'all for joining us. We did this because we're going out of town this weekend.
Yes.
And so this will be, you guys actually just caught. Y'all was first to see what we're going to load up on BPM later on. So this will be in place of our regular date night submission for Black Power Media. So we ask that you join, subscribe, all the housekeeping stuff, as y'all know. Like this video, share this video. Hey, check us out on Patreon. So join us on join this stream back on this repeat stream on Black Power Media later on.
That's right.
So again, I guess that's it.
Yeah, that's it. We'll see you guys next week. Peace. Be good to each other, as always.
And check out our new theme song for the Cypher.
Oh, excuse me. Goodness, I'm getting all choked up.